Hello and welcome to the first episode ever of the Fright Lounge, the show in which the best horrorologists in town will discuss horror in depth and get a conversation going for seasoned horror viewers, as well as helping introduce newbies to the horror genre. I'm Re-Gor from Then Is Now podcast and the East Meets the West podcast.
I'm Bill Van Ryn from Fanzine Drive-In Asylum and Facebook page Groovy Doom.
Awesome. Glad to have you on board, Bill. This is our first venture. And today we've got a special guest, my frequent co-host and sunny boy from Then Is Now, Spency. Glad to have you here, Spence.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Awesome. And Spence, you've got a special day coming up soon. It's the 21st birthday.
Yes, I'm getting up there. I feel old already.
It only gets worse, Spencer.
Right.
Yes, my favorite.
Hard to have to tell you.
And you know, Spence has been with me on this since 2016. We started Then Is Now way back when, and we did a handful of episodes, which if you people go back and into your podcasting app, whatever it may be, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, any of those or any of them really, we did like the first 5 episodes, I think, and we talked about stuff like the original Godzilla and the remake and
something like that. Yeah,
I think Forbidden Planet we talked about. And
oh yeah, Forbidden Planet. I think about that movie often, and I don't know.
Oh, it's a good movie. It's a really good movie. You know, so getting into the show here, we're going to be all about whether you're already into horror movies, because we're going to be talking horror, whether it's movies, books. We're going to go over all the different types of horror media that's out there. And if you don't know anything about horror, but you're interested, but maybe you're scared, because a lot of people who aren't into horror, they're often too afraid to check it out because they think it might be too scary or too gross or too gory, and they just simply don't know what to expect. So that's what we're going to try and do, is especially in this first episode, we're going to sort of lay out all the various genres in film, TV, books, games, video games, all kinds of media, and we'll help you navigate through the different types of horror, as well as having a great discussion with other like-minded horror fans. Now, this is the first episode, so like I said, we're just going to sort of outline everything that there is to talk about, maybe describe most of them as best we can. And ultimately, what we want to do is this episode's being recorded, but what we're planning on, hopefully, if it works out, the first Sunday of every month, we're going to go live on Facebook and YouTube, and that way you guys can ask questions, interact with us while we're talking about. We're going to have a different guest on each episode. It'll be me and Bill, who is to this side of me. Where is he? He's right there. No.
It's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah. I feel like we're the Brady Bunch.
I always point in the wrong direction.
So let's get into it. We've got some talking points here. Let's talk about how each of us got into horror movies. And I want you, the viewer at home, to sort of think about, if you are into horror movies right now, where did you start? Mine started way back in 1972. And I've told the story before and Then Is Now podcast. I was 2 years old and I was at the drive-in with my parents, and I saw the movie Asylum, which is an anthology film by Amicus, and had Peter Cushing and Herbert Lom in it. And it was just one of those movies that stuck with me vividly, and I was 2. And there's a particular sequence, because it's an anthology, so it's a series of short stories, and one of them, this lady's husband gets diced up into different parts, and each part is wrapped in meat paper, and there's a scene where like the hand that's in meat paper starts crawling across the floor at her, and the body parts just start moving, and I will never ever forget that. It scared the wits out of me. My mother and I afterwards didn't remember the name of the film, so for years we called it Chopping Heads. And another podcaster actually once said, wow, if there was a movie named Chopping Heads with Peter Cushing, I'm there,
Yeah, you wouldn't have to twist my arm.
Right. So from there, there was a lot of horror on TV, because we only had the handful of channels, and they were always showing movies because there were no movie channels. And they were always showing horror movies, so you always scoured the TV guide to try and find the next one, or even the scary TV show. I did a lot of walking to the library, got a lot of books, and we'll talk about horror books later on in the show. And yeah, so that's sort of where it all began for me. What about you, Bill?
Well, I think it was, I couldn't have been any more than 2, because this movie debuted in 1972, Gargoyles, which most of us have probably seen Gargoyles, made for TV movie from 1972. And this was really like the first time I had ever been exposed to anything that could be considered horror that I would even remember. There's something very childlike about gargoyles, as you can tell by the depiction of those creatures. On it, they really look kind of silly. Some of them are scary. Like Bernie Casey's gargoyle is very scary, but the rest of the gargoyles are almost like a Sid and Marty Krofft thing. And I was too young to know the difference between what's real and what isn't. And I just accepted this as the absolute truth. And I can remember watching it and being horrified because there's a scene where the gargoyles fly overhead and swoop down and grab Jennifer Salt and fly away with her. And I was like, oh my God, could that really happen? I mean, in whatever vernacular I had at 2 or 3. But I just was so upset and shocked. And my mother was furious at my dad for letting me watch it. I was hooked for life.
That's awesome. That is so cool. And were there any others?
Well, I was a monster kid, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
I don't know why. Or if any of us can even explain why we're attracted to that, when we're young. But I definitely was. And I saw as much of it on TV as I could. And I was very influenced by a local Pittsburgh horror host, Bill Cardill, who went by the name Chilly Billy on TV. He had a show called Chiller Theater, not to be confused with the one from New York with the 6-fingered hand that rises out of the swamp. It was Chiller. Right.
Yeah.
It's not that one. We had Chiller Theater in Pittsburgh as well. But the stuff that he showed on there really influenced my taste in films because he showed the old monster movies, like the black and white horror movies. He showed stuff from the 60s. Oh, my dog wants to get on camera. And he showed there was some really good exploitation stuff that played drive-ins in the 70s that ended up on Chiller Theater too, like Don't Look in the Basement. It just ran the gamut of everything that I became obsessed with later in life. I learned it all from Chiller Theater.
And you were lucky to have that show. I mean, we had in Boston in the 70s and 80s, we had a show called Creature Double Feature, which was on every Saturday around like 12:30. Yeah. And they played 2 movies, but we only had an announcer. He kind of did it in a creepy voice, but we didn't have horror hosts. Like I didn't know what a horror host was until when Creature Double Feature ended, they syndicated the show Son of Svengoolie, which now he's graduated and he's just Svengoolie. So that was sort of, I think I had seen Elvira probably around that time. So between those two, that was when I first saw horror hosts. And you're so lucky to have been able to have Chilly Billy, and he was in Night of the Living Dead. He had a small part in that.
Yes, he was. He was a TV reporter, which is what he was in real life. He worked for the news station. I think he did the weather. He was definitely a radio disc jockey. Bill Cardill did it all in local news media and television media. So when he played that part, he wasn't really acting. That was really who he was.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And did you have any books that inspired you as well?
Well, knowing that I was a monster kid, most of the adults in my life did not encourage this. And this is something that a lot of younger people don't realize, is that this was looked down on.
Right.
At least when I was a kid. Nobody trusted any kids that liked monster movies because kids are, they're kids. They're supposed to be afraid of this stuff. But that's not really the way it works. And, I was just obsessed with it. There was one member of my family that encouraged it, other than my dad, who showed me gargoyles. My Aunt Rosemary, she like catered to it, and she would buy me scary things. And she bought me this book called Horror Movies, written by Alan Frank.
Okay.
It's basically like a compendium, an overview of the horror genre dating all the way back to the beginning of films. And it's got all these great stills in it. I could have had it ready. It's falling apart, but I still have it. but everything that was in the book, and it went up until like, I think the book came out in 77, so it had everything up until 1976. Like, it talked about Texas Chainsaw Massacre in it, and it had a still image of it in there, and I was like horrified. I'm like, oh my god, what could this movie be? So it really set the bar about what I was going to get interested in, what movies I had to see. It was my list, horror movies.
Awesome. That's awesome. You know, one book I thought of, and maybe next week we'll do show and tell and bring our books, because I had one, I still have it. It's called Splatter Movies by John McCarty.
Yeah,
And
I had that one.
yeah, I had that in high school, and I brought it into high school. My parents actually loved horror movies, and they encouraged watching them and stuff. And my mother would cover my eyes through the sex scenes, but violence was okay. You know?
I guess
But
there's
yeah,
a rationale there.
yeah. I remember a teacher though looking at the book, going, "What the heck is wrong with you?"
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
now,
I got in trouble for taking Fangoria to school,
really,
and the teacher took it off my desk. I think I got up and went to the bathroom, and the other kids grabbed it and were looking at it, and she took it. I came back and it was gone. She did give it back to me though. She's like, "Don't ever bring anything like this into school again, or I'm just going to take it from you and throw it away."
oh God,
That's how people felt about
yeah,
horror stuff, you know.
yeah,
It was
wow.
bad.
Now, Spence, obviously, we said you're just about 21. So, what was your experience growing up with horror movies?
Well, with you as my father, it's a very different experience than what you two experienced. I had a very interesting upbringing with it, because obviously you were into it, and my mother is not nearly as interested in it.
No,
She's a lot more. She likes the thrillers, but she's not nearly as interested in the fantastic stuff that I like. I grew up on like Jason, Freddy, Michael Myers, and the Universal monster movies. Those were the ones that I vividly remember watching when I was a kid, and that's your fault, because you have now captured my imagination with all of that stuff. The whole concept of, werewolves and vampires and just monsters that could exist are always super really cool to me.
yeah,
So I enjoy things like Alien and all that stuff, but the Universal monster movies were really the ones that had captured my imagination from the very beginning. And when it comes to horror movies, I still love all the slasher films. I don't get scared of them anymore. There's only a couple ones where there's actually a few good scares anymore. People still to this day, even people my age, are like, "Oh my god, those are like so gory," and I'm like, guys, it's from '82. Like, they did their best. It's a good movie, but they did their best. So it's not too bad. But my favorite one right now is the Saw franchise, because I
yeah.
just love everything about that franchise right now, especially with Chris Rock in the news. So, and
Oh yeah.
he's part of the creative comeback for that whole franchise. So I'm super excited about that. But something else that stoked my love of horror was two different directions. One was H.P. Lovecraft. Big fan of his books, big fan of his short stories, and just how he does things. I do like Stephen King and Edgar Allan Poe. Those are the two big ones that I can think of. But H.P. Lovecraft also really hit different for me. And I'm a big gamer, so horror games are super up my alley. And the earliest ones that I can remember being in horror games, first of all, the earliest one is that Evil Dead game you have on the PlayStation 2. I remember playing that as a little kid, and I could not get past like the first 2 feet. I would be very scared, and I was
It
just like,
still
"Nope, I
scares
can't
me.
do it." It's pretty bad. I did play it. I did play it. It's a fun zombie game, but it is still pretty good when it comes to the scare factor. The things that I discovered on my own were when I was first learning what the internet was, and back when it was the Wild West. There was a game called Five Nights at Freddy's, and this was a big one that captured my imagination as well, because it was this very, very indie game where you just sat in a desk and looked left and right and looked at cameras, and you were being hunted by these animatronic Chuck E. Cheese like characters, and you had to survive a whole work week there. You were doing the midnight shift and all this stuff, and it was awesome. And it was the first like community that I had been a part of, and I was super interested in the storytelling. And it kind of moved on for me, because then soon after that was Outlast, which is basically you're trapped in an asylum and you have to escape, and you play this reporter, and it's a very fun, you don't fight back, you run and hide type game. And that was one of the first horror games that I remember finishing and loving from beginning to end. And I've now moved on to more of the survival horror genre, and the first one of my favorites, has so much nostalgia attached to it, The Evil Within. It's kind of like I don't want to use the word. I don't want to say the Matrix, but it's basically you end up getting kidnapped and trapped in this simulation. And for most of the game, you don't know it's a simulation. It's a survival horror game. You play as your third person character, and you got to go and collect ammunition and manage resources. So for me, horror is a variety of things. It's got my movies that capture my imagination and the books that creep me the hell out. But then the games I find to be really fun because I do enjoy the fear factor of it, especially with the newest games and how they've got their own central community compared to all the other video games out there.
Awesome.
The first horror video game that I can remember is Haunted House for Atari. Did you have that, Roger?
Yes, I still have my Atari. I think I still have that one.
I still have it too. I have ColecoVision, but there's an adapter where you can play Atari games, and it's like right here beside me, actually.
That's awesome.
But the Haunted House was like you were moving through. You had to visualize the house because you couldn't see anything. You were just a pair of eyes, and you had like so many matches in your pocket, and you could light a match, and you could see like maybe like a small area around you, and you would find stuff in a dark mansion.
Yeah,
maze game.
And it would be funny because
great.
like you turn the corner and then it would load the image of what you're seeing there, and then you walk down the hall and then it would load the image.
There was like monsters chased you, like a ghost, a bat, and something else, a spider.
Yeah.
Something really fun about that is the concept of like matches and stuff. One of the most famous horror games ever was called Amnesia: The Dark Descent. And naturally you play a character who has amnesia and he doesn't remember anything. So it's this whole, uncovering the story, and a lot of the game mechanics revolve around if you spend time in darkness, you lose your sanity, which in turn is what will kill you. Also getting attacked by monsters will kill you and stuff like that. So you have to kind of keep your lantern and your matches up and stuff like that. So that trend of matches has been around since the very beginning, it looks like.
Oh yeah.
It's my favorite. Awesome. I love it.
That's awesome. So moving on here, and we'll get back to the video games in a little bit, but I just want to start off by talking about the different various subgenres in horror, especially in the horror films, particularly. Spence, did you want to go with this?
Yeah. When you were doing all your notes on this, I was looking at it and I'm like, horror films. There's so much more to horror than this. But yeah, my favorite stuff comes from monsters and kaiju films and stuff like that. But there's still the slasher films, the thrillers, the psychological thrillers, and all that stuff. You have here exploitation and Italian horror and Spanish horror as whole categories. I find that interesting.
Yeah,
and all that stuff, because they do it differently. Horror comedies and all that stuff. Those ones are really fun. There's a lot of options in the horror films because they've had a lot of time to work with. So you have films like Paranormal Activity is not the same thing as Friday the 13th.
Right, exactly. Supernatural horror, I guess that was what we would maybe subcategorize that as. And you've got your classic scary movies, like you mentioned, Spence, the Universal horrors. Which, by the way, over on Then Is Now, we've been doing a series within the show trying to get people to help others get into horror. And that's where we started, because that, as much as I saw like Asylum and a lot of other horror movie films as a kid, a lot of horror movies as a kid, I do vividly remember the Universals and all those black and white movies. And those were far tamer than what was coming out in the 70s, So I think that we chose Chris, my co-host on Then Is Now, and I chose that route to go as a recommendation if you wanted to start getting into horror movies that way. But there's so many other things. There's TV movies like Steven Spielberg's Duel, Trilogy of Terror, the Dan Curtis film with the famous Zuni. I wish I had a picture of it right now. The Zuni fetish doll. And of course, Kolchak the Night Stalker started off as a couple TV movies, right, Bill? And then it went to a series.
Yeah, there was the Night Stalker and then the Night Strangler, and after that came the series. Just like that was really amazing because that came along right at the time when horror movies were starting to be depicted taking place in the modern day. Prior to the early 70s, you really didn't see that aside from Night of the Living Dead. One of the reasons it was so groundbreaking. It wasn't often, like sometimes it would, but a lot of the vampire stuff was like set in Transylvania and a long time ago. but the Night Stalker was a vampire in modern day, and that was really scary.
Yeah.
Yes. Something to add on to that is I noticed one of the last Universal monster movies that they ever made was Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which
Yeah.
was a horror comedy, but it was still a very good horror movie, and I thought it was done very well, and you could take a lot of notes from it. But something I noticed was there's a whole point where at the very beginning, the Wolfman is calling, about the remains of Dracula, and he doesn't want it to, to come back and all that stuff. And he's in London calling Florida, which is a lot more close to home than Eastern Europe, which is basically where all of the Frankenstein stuff happened, and all of the Dracula stuff was happening over in Europe. So it felt a lot more close to home at that point. And then you move on in the 50s to Creature from the Black Lagoon, where they go down to the Amazon, which is far and distant. It could never happen. And then the second one, they bring him back to Florida
Right.
again.
Yep.
I thought that was an interesting change they made to make things a little bit more more entertaining, was that it became more close to home than
Yeah,
ever.
I think a lot of the horror films of the 50s that sort of leaned towards science fiction tended to take place nowadays, like The Manster, or what was the one where the rocks would grow really tall and then
The
fall on you?
Monolith Monsters.
Monolith Monsters. That's a great movie, by the way.
It is. Yeah. It's not
Um,
what I wanted as a kid. Like, I didn't think rocks could be monsters, but when I watched it, I was like, wow, that really was good.
Yeah, you wouldn't think it. I had a quick picture here I just wanted to share with the audience because I can. And this is an image of Kolchak the Night Stalker. That's Darren McGavin.
Mm.
And those of you who maybe aren't familiar with Kolchak, he was the dad in the film A Christmas Story that they play 24 hours a day on Christmas time. So I think Kolchak is one of those ones that we won't forget. It was a great show. And there was so many good, a lot of in terms of horror movies, like TV horror movies that could still be scary. You didn't have to be a rated R film to be scary.
Yeah, a lot of that was just atmosphere, especially because it was a weekly program, Kolchak. They didn't have a lot of budget to make an elaborate monster. Some of them were pretty silly. Like there was one with a lizard that walked upright and had a head like an alligator.
Yeah,
that looked really bad. And a couple of the other monsters, the werewolf didn't. There was a werewolf episode. He didn't look so great, but it was a lot of it had to do with just how spooky that whole concept was. That there could be, Kolchak was a news reporter, and he went out looking for these supernatural stories, and like it's the forerunner to the X-Files.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, you're right. It was taking place in modern day, and it was super scary. But that was what made it special to me. That's what made it resonate.
Right. And there were a lot of other ones. I mean, they were just like one-off movies. Like what was that one? The Dark Secret of Harvest Home. That was scary for its time.
Sure. Dark Night of the Scarecrow.
Yes.
A lot of the best stuff that comes out of horror films specifically is, and this is something that scares a lot of my friends and all that stuff when it comes to horror movies, is just the atmosphere and the tension. You walk into a horror film knowing it's a horror film, but if you look at some things in certain action movies, there are really terrifying sequences that go on, and especially with the older movies where they had to get creative a lot of the time. I think a good action to horror sequence. I doubt either of you have touched any of the Batman games recently, but
No.
in one of the latest ones, there's this whole sequence near the end of the game. Now, up until this point, you've been fighting criminals, doing cool stuff. But in every game, there's been a whole like mind-altering sequence that was either through Joker or Scarecrow. And there's this whole first-person encounter where they actually give you a gun and you're actually first person and all that stuff. And you're going around and you're not the character you think you are, but eventually there's like weeping angel style statues coming at you, and you're in a dark room with just your flashlight, and it's awful. It's so horrifying for an action game, right? It's very, very awful. But then when you finally get out of it, you're like, oh my god, that was so satisfying for the plot. But when you're in there, you're like, okay, I signed up to play a Batman game. This is not what I wanted. So you can get a lot of good sequences, even in well-established media, of scary moments that can be done well, and some audiences will love it, and they're like, oh, I don't like horror films, but I loved that moment in insert movie here,
Right.
which it's clearly intended to be horror.
Yeah.
So it's
yeah.
all about expectation. I think a lot of people, especially my age, expect films to be super graphic or super jump scare type,
Right.
which they really weren't for the most part.
And that's a good talking point, the jump scare, which Bill, isn't that's sort of a relatively new thing in films? And when I say new, I mean like the last 20 years, right? The jump scare. I mean, there's always been jump scares, but the way they're overused these days.
Well, yeah, I think it started to become more and more synonymous with horror movies. But it was always, I mean, it was always there. You can think all the way back to, there were old black and white movies where they would like look in the window and all of a sudden there'd be a face there. Or when they open the lab door in The Thing and it's standing right there. I mean, those were all jump scares. And it's
Yeah.
sort of like seen as people used to think of it as a cheap shot. I think that's a better way to think of it. Is it used to be frowned upon to use a lot of jump scares and be like, well, your movie's not that good, but you can put some jump scares in there and people will be scared. But now it's what people want. Like
Right.
it started to be more and more what people expected. And if there weren't jump scares, then maybe people complained. We're like, oh, that movie wasn't scary.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think that as the times and the effects have gotten better, we've gotten into this really strange situation where people expect jump scares and don't like them, but then when they're not there, there's this like, oh, well, I suppose it was all tension based, and I'm like, yeah, I could kind of see it. I don't usually get destroyed by jump scares in movies because I tend to find them not nearly as impactful as certain games because I'm just not nearly as close to the situation. When you're in a game, you're there. You cannot progress until you are the one to run past the monster. Whereas you watch a movie, it's a big shock. You can breathe, you're good, my heart stops and all that stuff. But I think they're necessary to some extent. I like them. I think they set the mood. But there are some that have gotten me. I'll name drop it. My favorite one is The Descent.
Oh, I was gonna
Um,
say that.
that there's this amazing jump scare which essentially changes the entire horror of the film. So the first half is them like caving and like claustrophobia, and then there's these creatures that they have to deal with, which is a complete 180. And they were hinting at it, but it was still this complete 180 ordeal. And the jump scare, I think you might have told me this, Pop, but that jump scare was real, as in the person standing there when the camera comes and sees them, the actual actresses who were the main protagonists did not know that they were there.
Right.
So it was so much worse for the audience as well, because the actresses also were screaming just as much as we were
Yeah, and
and
I
all
don't
that
think
stuff.
they had even seen like the costume or the makeup or anything, and the director just didn't say anything. The guy, or the monster, was just in the background behind them, and then they turn around. It was like
When it's well done, it's well done.
Yeah.
It just depends on whether whether it works in the movie or not. There is no, well, you should or shouldn't do it. It's just like, well, is your movie good with it? Then it's
Right.
good.
But does
Yeah.
your movie hinge on it? That's the make or break.
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
can. I can think of a lot of great movies though that had a lot of jump scares in it, like Halloween has like
mm,
Yeah.
jump scare after jump scare in it at one point. Like, the body swings out and Lori like backs up into Sheriff Brackett out in the street. That scared the hell out of me the first time I saw Halloween. So
yeah.
everything scared me the first time I saw it.
I
Uh,
remember rewatching Halloween and thinking how how much worse I remembered it being, because when I watched it with a lot more critical of an eye, I didn't think of it as super scary, but I did understand how it can be very, very horrifying for that one specifically, because there's a whole point where one of the girls gets in her car. She's in the garage and he pops up from behind the back seat and starts to strangle her. And you're just
yeah.
like, and like, that's just totally unexpected. And I thought that worked really well, but it definitely was one of those situations where it added to it and didn't take away from it, because on the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise that I mentioned, the way the game ends is you either succeed or you get a jump scare, which is a big loud sound and a scary creature in your face for 2 seconds, and then it's game over. So
Right.
when you play that
Yeah.
game, it becomes a matter of death is the same thing as a jump scare, So it's not always the best thing, but it works for the indie game for what it was doing. Whereas a lot of the AAA games don't do that nearly as often. They do a few in good spots, but then they tend to like shy away from it.
Right, right. So, Bill, can you speak to some movies that were made for not made for TV, but yet got a lot of play?
Yeah, there was I already mentioned a little bit when I talked about chiller theater. There were some movies were just always on TV, even though they were theatrical films. I'm talking about scary movies or the low budget horror films. There was a package that was sold to syndicated TV, and one of the films in it was on TV. It was known as Twisted Brain, but later I learned that it was actually a 1974 theatrical film, 73 theatrical film called Horror High, and but and it was it had a theatrical run. It actually played many years theatrically, like on drive-in bills. But I thought of it as a TV movie because that's how I saw it, and it was always on at least once a year, sometimes even twice, which was a lot back then. Like you
Yeah.
didn't back before you could just summon things out of the thin air to watch, which you could stream it off YouTube or wherever. You had to wait for something to be on TV, and it became sort of a celebratory event. You're like, oh, I love that movie, Twisted Brain. It's going to be on again. I'm going to stay up and watch it. So that became synonymous with TV for me. There were a couple things, and Don't Look in the Basement was another one. And that was just something that I always saw on syndicated TV, and it was a theatrical film, but I thought of it more as a TV movie.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, there's so many of those. And so, and it's funny when you start to think back now where you had, I mean, Universal kind of dominated, but there were other studios that made horror movies, supernatural, scary movies, whatever, what have you, sci-fi horror, down through like from the 30s into the 50s, most of which were mainly black and white. And then as you got into the 60s, things started to change. The tastes were changing in the audience. Frankenstein wasn't scaring them anymore. They needed something a little bit more visceral. So then you had like the Hammer films, where it was sort of a retelling of the Dracula, Frankenstein, all those famous Universal films, only in living color with bright red blood, and that was horrifying audiences. And then of course you have I want to say that it's a pivotal or a linchpin movie, which we mentioned before, Night of the Living Dead, which just kind of changed the game for everything because people didn't know how to react to it at first. And when you got to the 70s and into the 80s, then you got a lot more special effects in terms of gore. And so there are some films that are labeled gore films, or as I mentioned, the book I have, Splatter Films. Then you've got, slasher films, which Roger Ebert hated Friday the 13th. He was on a crusade against slasher movies. But there was, tell us a little bit more about these movies, Bill.
Well, it was just sort of, you mean splatter films?
Splatter films, slasher films.
Well, that was right when I was starting to become a huge horror fan. Like I went from being a monster kid to being a horror geek when the slasher films came out because suddenly it became validated in popular culture. It wasn't something that people rolled their eyes whenever you talked about how you liked scary movies. Like these were movies that were being released theatrically, and every week there'd be like two or three new ones. Like after the success of Halloween and Friday the 13th, it became bankable. So you just, money talks, and people started making more and more of them. And then all of a sudden, it was a culturally significant thing that all these movies were happening. And there were some very negative reactions to it, like Siskel and Ebert. I mean, they were really offended by it. And perhaps that had something to do with the fact that they had a TV show and it gave them something to talk about on their
Right.
TV show, something to rail against that seemed important, So that was what sort of that means to me when you talk about slasher films or even splatter films. That was a very cool era to have lived through. And there's a graphic from one of the most notorious gore films, Dawn of the Dead. This movie was legendary to me when I was young. This was 1970. It was made in 78, but it didn't come out in the States until 79. So I was about 9 years old when people started talking about Dawn of the Dead and how graphic and gory it was. So that was sort of like, the allure of the forbidden was what the slashers and the slasher films were, and the fact that there was just so much of it. It was proliferating, and suddenly it became, big business.
And these films were often, the effects guys were trying to top previous films. So how much more
Yeah.
outrageous can we get,
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of competition. At least there should have been. There are some movies that didn't get the message, like Terror Train,
Yeah.
which is a movie that I love. And even though there's like decapitation in it, and maybe a couple other things, it really was not all that graphic, and it would have been a classic if it had been. People would still be talking about Terror Train to this day. And Maniac was another big one. You had a graphic up for that. That was an extremely graphic film. That was one of the ones you couldn't even go see if you were under the age of 18.
Right.
It was like having an X rating because they released it unrated, and you weren't allowed in if you were under the age of 18 because of the graphic violence, not any sex.
Right, right. And that was a big bone of contention too that we could talk about on another show, where you couldn't advertise a film after a certain point. You couldn't advertise a film if it got an X rating in the newspapers
Yeah.
and on TV. So the studios were worried that they wouldn't make any money.
You could advertise it in the newspaper, but like back in the 70s at least,
Yeah.
and maybe even the early 80s, there might have been some places, some newspapers wouldn't carry X-rated advertisements. Like you would see it in, the LA Times and some of the larger city metropolitan areas. They weren't shy about running X-rated movie ads, but there were some places you could not advertise if it was X-rated. So yeah, it limited the audience if you had that rating. So you had to work around it.
Yeah. Yeah. So we move on. We've got a lot more categories. We've got slasher films, as we mentioned, and then there's the thrillers and the psychological thrills. I think like people like my wife and others, that's more to their taste. And here I got one here. That's the one I always think of when we talk about psychological thrillers. Is of course Silence. Oopsies, I bumped the picture.
Oh, I never finished that.
Oh, you've got to watch it. It's really
I
good.
never finished it. Me and my girlfriend, we started it and we just never ended up finishing it. That wait, isn't
Oh,
that
that's one.
Silence sorry, Silence of the Lambs is one of the few horror films I believe that won Best Picture.
Correct.
Yeah.
I think it was that, and was it Frederick March's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from like the 40s?
Well,
Probably.
Silence of the Lambs sort of masquerades as a more legitimate type of film, like it because it had Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins, and it was based on a popular novel, so it wasn't really marketed as a horror movie, even though that's really what it was. It was very scary.
Yeah, I remember watching through that and thinking that how good it was for the first half that I saw. And when it comes to the Academy Awards, I cannot stand the Academy Awards because all the things that I like never get nominated for anything super good when they totally deserve it to some extent. I mean, in years past, we've had big outrages about like the Avengers movies and the new Spider-Man movie that just came out, and like that wasn't even on the bill for most of these. And especially not sci-fi or horror, those get shafted comparatively.
Sure.
Yeah. And
when it comes,
go ahead.
go for it. I was just gonna say, when it comes to horror movies, also something to keep in mind is content. Is that what scares an audience at a certain time? So back in the 40s, you're dealing with famous literary characters. You're dealing with old legends being brought to the big screen. You're seeing Dracula, you're seeing Frankenstein, and you're seeing a werewolf for the first time on screen. The first time you can actually put eyes to it and it's moving. That's kind of awesome. And then in the 50s, like you said, Pop, that it goes like to the science fiction, and that was the big thing because that was what they were super obsessed with was, space and all that stuff. Even Creature from the Black Lagoon in all three movies mentions multiple times about space travel, and like
Right.
that's the goal. That's the quintessential thing that we're all shooting for. The 60s was a big transitional period, and then in the 70s and 80s, it eventually developed into the religious panic, where you had things like Poltergeist and Exorcist that were had these religious implications, and that was really scary. It even ties over into Dungeons and Dragons. There was a satanic panic all about them. It was
Yeah.
going to turn your kid into a devil worshiper if you played this role playing game, which definitely not. My friend wrote a paper on it. So
Oh,
he gave me all
I
the
know a
details.
few who turned to devil worship from Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh yeah, yeah.
They even
big
made
big
a
source.
they made a TV movie about that with Tom Hanks. I think it was called Wizards and Warriors, and it was about this kid who plays D&D, but then he in his mind he gets lost in this crazy world and is really killing people. Or I don't know. I don't think I ever actually saw it. Did you see that one, Bill?
I know. I don't think I did.
But yeah, Spence brought up the Creature from the Black Lagoon, and it's a sci-fi, it's a horror, it's also a monster movie, and a lot of us fans love our monster movies. And you could argue, the Wolfman is more of a monster movie than a horror movie or whatever, but there are tons of other horror films like I mentioned, The Manster. That's a good one. But then you've got sort of, I'd like to call them probably ground level monsters because one-on-one humans can kind of take them on. But then you've got what's known as kaiju. You want to tell us what kaiju are, Spencer?
Oh, these are my specialty. Uh, the kaiju films, basically, the term refers to a subgenre of primarily films that deal with giant monsters, hundreds of feet tall, these titanic beasts, and all the stuff that they do. And kaiju is essentially in Japanese, I believe it refers to like strange beast or weird animal. And obviously, the most famous one is Godzilla. I mean, he's the big name that's always been around for the past 60 years. And all that stuff. And I love kaiju films to death. I love them. I could sit through them constantly, and I love the action, but I also love a lot of the implications with it, especially the first Godzilla. I rewatched that and I forgot how scary that was because that is not a monster movie for the most part. That is a disaster movie. That is a humans mean nothing situation. That is San Andreas, that is 2012, that is Greenland. That is not nearly as close to
Yeah.
the other films we saw, and I enjoyed that because that's obviously the intent from Ishiro Honda and all that stuff. And that scared Japanese audiences way more than it scared American audiences for obvious cultural reasons back in the 1950s and
Right.
1940s.
Well, and especially, yeah, obviously coming off of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that was raw, and they were still reeling from that. But unfortunately, the Americans really didn't get the true version of Godzilla for quite a long time, right, Bill?
It was decades, I think, before maybe it was the 90s is when I first started seeing the original version.
Yeah,
Jeez.
yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's when you and I spent. Oh well, obviously not the '90s because you weren't invented then, but when we
No.
covered the original Godzilla and we talked about the difference between the Japanese and the American versions, and
the American version I didn't think was a bad film.
oh
And
no,
I thought it was actually they did a good job of not like devaluing what the Japanese producers had already made, because they basically inserted Raymond Burr, and he was like a news reporter or something like that. Like he was a foreigner to Japan. It wasn't this like full blown whitewash situation. It was like, no, unfortunately we can't put in Japanese protagonists for a few reasons at the time, and they didn't really shy away from it because the whole narration is like the whole beginning of the American version is they're like panning around the destroyed city and Raymond Burr's narrating like what sort of monster could have done this. And it does shoot for the same intentions, but it just doesn't have the same cultural impact. Because I think they tried to like rename it Gigantus or something like that when it came over,
What
and
was
all that
the
stuff.
the second film was called Gigantus the Fire Monster.
That's right.
Yeah, that's what it was. And so it wasn't Godzilla Raids Again, which I still
No.
think is just as good as the first one because you get to see it. A, they upped the ante because they brought in a second monster. B, they still focused on the fact that that there was a lot worse of a situation actually because it continues the first movie in a very loose way. And they're basically like, yeah, so the one weapon we did have to fight Godzilla, not there anymore. We took the scientist with it who invented it. So that was that. And it was, they both basically leaned into it both times, and I thought it was really good. It's not until you get to the 1960s when there's like a good long gap between Godzilla Raids Again and King Kong vs. Godzilla, and King Kong vs. Godzilla is in color, and there's a whole story with that movie all on its own about script stealing and replacing characters and all that stuff. And it explains a lot of the weird things that go on in the movie, but that was kind of more of a, I don't want to say whimsical, but it was a lot less gritty and rough when it came to it. It was, they're giant monsters fighting. We've got these two big guys and we get to, see them go toe to toe. Isn't that awesome? And it didn't have the disaster movie feel. And the kaiju genre kind of shed that relatively quickly with a few notable exceptions. But it started to become this franchise situation where Toho was bringing in all kinds of other monsters into
Right.
their little bubble there.
And that's another one for us growing up was, Godzilla movies were always on the Chilla theaters or creature features or whatever. Right, Bill? You watched a lot of those, I assume.
Well, on WOR from New York, which was an early super station, meaning it was carried on many different cable platforms. Back before there were 100 channels you could choose from, WOR was one of them, like TBS. And we got it I'm from Pittsburgh, but we got this channel out of New York, and every year on Thanksgiving they would show like 3 or 4 King Kong movies, and Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, they'd show 3 or 4 Godzilla movies. So that's where I watched a lot of that stuff for the first time. Was seeing it like probably like in the late 70s is when I started branching out and watching every single one that was on. And I was like, I don't care what it is. I just want to see it if it says Godzilla.
Right,
Yeah, I was
right.
in the same boat. I mean, for me growing up, I was, growing up in the 2000s. So I was just coming off of their constant churning of the Millennium series, which,
Hmm.
they had like, there were a bunch of, individual movies that didn't really connect to each other. But they all had like really, really cool, super good looking effects and stuff like that. So I actually, to some extent, get some of them jumbled up in my head when I think about them because I've seen them all at least once. And those were the ones that I was super, super into. I mean, Godzilla Final Wars, was the 50th anniversary project that they were doing. And that to me that was my Godzilla, right? That was what I grew up on. That was the thing I watched the most of. And I got the most interest in all of it from that one. But I knew of all these other ones that I had come before it. I knew that he had this whole history. I got to see Destroy All Monsters and all the other ones that had come before it. So for me personally, I was interested in this, and I was lucky enough to be exposed to all the previous stuff that had been. A lot of my friends think I'm weird for that. They don't quite understand the deep love I have for a good giant monster, and they don't understand why I watch certain movies. They're like, "Oh yeah, like Pacific Rim, it was like the coolest dumb movie I've ever seen," and I fight them on that, standing by that most of these movies are really good. So it's a very weird time with the kaiju genre for specifically when you're trying to be scared because it has to have this level of trying to be scary as well as it has to hit the culture correctly because none of the latest Godzilla movies are trying to be scary except for actually Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack, a top tier title. Um, that I think that's the movie where Godzilla is like this amalgamation of the souls of those lost in World War II. And it was meant to be this like cultural reckoning for the newest generation of Japanese young people who didn't have an idea. And there was a kind of a weird system with how the Japanese government handled the atrocities that went on and all that
Right.
stuff. So that was kind of one of the weird ones. And then Shin Godzilla later is one of the more
Yeah.
recent ones. And that had to do with a lot of the pollution and toxic waste that had been dumped into the ocean over in Asia and
Right.
all that stuff. And they were suffering the effects of that. So it's been used as a really, really good stepping point for a lot of things, but there's also been a majority of it as it's just a monster movie, and that's all it wants to be.
I got a side note, Bill. When Shin Godzilla came out, it was the first Toho Godzilla production in I think a decade, right? Final Wars was the last one, Spence.
So Final Wars was '04. The American Godzilla,
Right.
the legendary Godzilla, he's my Godzilla. I grew up with him. Like he has a special place in my heart, and I love every second of it. But
But
that came out in 2014. Shin Godzilla came out in 2016.
right. And
That
I
was 2
think
years
Final
later.
Wars was 2006, wasn't it?
2004.
2004. So,
That was the
anyways,
50th
my
anniversary.
point was this was the first Toho Godzilla film in a decade or over a decade. And Spence and I, we had to go see it. And we had to go see it in the theater. We get there an hour early and the damn movie is sold out. So I'm like, just gonna buy. I'm thinking in my mind, I'm just gonna buy tickets for another movie and walk in there. Who cares? And that's exactly what the guy behind the counter told us to do. He's like, well, you could buy tickets for this movie and nobody will notice if you go into Godzilla. So we went in.
Where were you going to sit?
Well, this was the advent of when they had seats that are numbered now that you buy the tickets. So we kind of walked in, we looked around, and there was like say 3 seats and then a space for a wheelchair, then 3 seats and space for a wheelchair. So we went to one of those spaces and we just sat down because behind us was like stadium seating. So you had the railing and then the access there. So we just sat there for a few minutes, and after I think like 15 minutes in, Spence, we realized there was a couple of chairs that nobody was sitting in, and we went and sat in.
Yeah. So it happens a lot in movies. Is even with the exception of like the big ones and the releases and all that stuff. Most times, if you see like a sold out film, some people aren't coming. It
Right.
just always happens. It's just statistically speaking. So we were just lucky enough to be like, hey, there's 2 seats over there, and we just sat there the rest of the movie, and nobody said anything. I
Back
love
in
that movie too.
back in 2019, I did a screening in Pittsburgh of 3 vintage Godzilla movies. They were 35 millimeter prints of Monster Zero, Destroy All Monsters, and Godzilla versus the Cosmic Monster.
Oh wow.
And we did it as a triple feature. It was me and Harry Guerro from Exhumed Films put on this show. And it was really amazing seeing those movies in 35 millimeter on a big screen because, I was just used to see them on a tiny little box. Oh, wow, it's a giant monster. But it was really pretty exciting, I have to say. I'm sorry my dog is barking.
Oh, I don't hear it. So
Okay, that's good.
I get people walking through here at all times and they're like tiptoeing, trying to be quiet. But yeah, it's Spence, did you want to just finish up on Godzilla by talking about how it's sort of about man's punishment?
Yeah, well, I mean, once again, the kaiju films, they do this thing where they toe the line between mysticism, science, and the scare factor a lot of the time. So some of the more classic ones we talk about are ones that are leaning into the being scary because of this humans can do what they want, but no matter what, the giant creature is still the giant creature that you cannot defeat. And a lot of its origins have to do with like, oh, even King Kong, who's an American invention, has this mystic origin of like he is a god to these people, which is the same thing with Godzilla. Even from the very first movie, he's a local legend that finally gets awakened because of nuclear testing in the Pacific.
Right.
And there's this, they toe the line between being a disaster film and being scary because of it, but also having this like it's still a cool giant monster, and there's some science in there thrown in there as well. I mean, even Godzilla Final Wars, which was the 50th anniversary movie, has mutants, aliens, giant monsters, kung fu fights, giant monster kung fu fights. Like what more can you want from a movie like that? It's not trying to be scary anymore. So the genre, I think, is not the quintessential horror genre. I think it's its own category at this point. But some of them do a good job of being scary because they feel like they could be real, especially with Shin Godzilla, because that was a lot more from the politician's perspective. And I enjoyed it. A lot of people, I read a lot of like criticism, like, oh, they felt like it was boring. I'm like, I don't know, it's different. I liked it. So I thought that was pretty scary because you're seeing it. They're like, we don't know what to do. Like, okay, giant monster destroying the city. What do we do? And they look so panicked, and that's what's scary, is that there is no immediate quick response. The military isn't coming in to handle the situation. There's no handling of the situation,
Right.
which is part of the fear factor when it comes to those movies. And I don't care for disaster films because I don't see a clear ending half the time, but I like giant monster disaster movies because they do have this sort of clear ending half the time. And even back in 54, first Godzilla follows the traditional sense of the monster does lose. And even then, most of the time, the monster is not actually the villain of the situation. He's just the person causing the problem. If that
Right.
makes sense. Like Frankenstein's monster he's a victim in most of the situation. He's new.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah,
the same thing, right? It's the same thing. They end up, killing the monster in the end. Spoiler alert. And
the
that's kind of
monster
how it
doesn't always know
ends.
what it's doing. It's just
No,
doing its thing.
one of Ishiro Honda is the director of the first Godzilla movie, and actually most of the a few
That's so
originals.
listening. Yeah.
One of his famous quotes was like, monsters are, too big and too loud and too strong, and they don't know what they're doing, and we can't help but feel bad for them.
Hmm.
I love that.
Interesting. Interesting. So moving on from the Godzilla films, the Kaiju films, because we had others from other companies like Gamera, Friend to the Children, Giant Turtle.
That's a different, yeah, it's a different side of the kaiju genre in general.
Right. Where it became more cartoony and more for kids, which
Mm.
there's nothing wrong with that because as a kid, I loved Gamera. I'm like, oh, he's Friend to the Children. He's got to be awesome.
Sure. He had a great garage band that played his theme too.
Oh, yeah.
Camera.
Gamera. Gamera is fun to eat. Gamera is full of meat. Is that the one you're thinking of, Phil?
I guess. I don't know how many Gamera songs are there.
I was doing the one from Mystery Science Theater. So
I just remember them jamming in the
Yeah.
movie Gamera.
That's awesome.
They were like a Japanese American style garage band, and they reminded me a little bit of the Plastics who came along later in the late 70s.
Oh, yeah. Oh, interesting. I'll have to check that out. I don't think I've actually heard that.
Well, the Plastics were new wave. This was sort of like, a rock and roll garage band that I
Right.
remember. I don't know. It's been like 40 years since I saw it, so I could be misremembering things.
It's funny. So moving on from the giant monster films, there's a lot of other subcategories of horror. And again, a lot of them stretch into either it could be gore or mystery, thriller. Where's my other hand? There it is. And you've got, like exploitation movies. I think there are a lot of horror movies that fall under the category of exploitation movies. Not all exploitation films are horror, but a lot of them are. And on episode 39 of Then Is Now podcast, we had this guy on, Eric Eichelberger, who's actually coming back on the show pretty soon. And he's working on a documentary about exploitation films called Exploit This. Bill, do you want to fill us in and let the audience know what an exploitation film kind of is?
Well, I'm bad with categories, and it's hard to say sometimes what the actual definition of a thing is. But to me, an exploitation film is just an inexpensive movie that was made to make money. And instead of, because when you went to the theater to see a movie and you didn't like it, you didn't get your money back because you didn't like it.
Right.
So if they could get you in there and get you into the theater and make a big sensation for playing a week, and then if the movie wasn't the kind of thing that anybody would go see twice, if you know what I mean, like they would just, that was it, that was what you made, and then it would hang around at the drive-in a little bit. To me, that's an exploitation film. It was something that was just made. It was usually very sensational, and it was just meant to get theaters butts into seats for a weekend, and then it would go, and you wouldn't see very much of it anymore. A
Right.
lot of them were like ultra low budget movies. That was their whole intent, unless it was an art film or something. You were putting something out there. It was a product that was meant to make money, and it had to be about something that would lure people into the theater.
Right. And so they would exploit a lot of things that were very popular. Like, for example, there were a lot of biker movies that were exploitation films because they fit all that criteria. You said they were ultra low budget, only played at grindhouse theaters, and they exploited, for example, the biker genre or way of life or whatever you want to call it.
It was a trend, and people were exploiting this trend. They're
Right.
like, okay, well, we'll make this movie. Remember that movie you saw a couple weeks ago that you kind of liked? It was a biker movie. We'll get you back with something different. It's not the same movie. You could go see a new movie about bikers,
Yeah.
and it would ride for a while. Like, they'd ride the wave and then wait for the next thing.
Yeah. And there were so many I've read the list. There's a list on Wikipedia, and it's like nunsploitation, shark exploitation. There's just all kinds of crazy subcategories in that. But there's also,
Exploitation,
what?
exploitation,
Exploitation, yeah.
like after Deliverance.
Yeah, that's right. Oh man. But then, I think other countries have always been making movies as much as America. But you've got, especially in like this from the 60s to the 80s, you got the Italian films, the Italian horror films, especially when they started probably around the 70s with the Giallos, which Giallo means yellow in Italian. And there were these sort of thriller novels that had a yellow spine. So when you walked in the bookstore, you could instantly recognize them. And they started turning these types of stories into movies. And they all sort of, not all, but most of them have like a common thread, right, Bill? Like the killer, it's from the killer's point of view, and he's wearing black gloves, and you don't really know who
Oh,
the final real.
yeah. There's all sorts of criteria about what a giallo is and isn't, and I'm afraid to say anything about it, because if it's wrong, I'm really bad at categorizing things. But
Right.
yeah, everything that you said is typically what refers to a giallo. But I mean, that was one type of horror movie, but really, to me, the Italian horror cinema begins with Mario Bava's Black Sunday,
Right.
which was 1964. And because I guess in Italy, you weren't allowed to represent certain types of themes in cinema, because it was considered, immoral. Uh, and so there was no way to have horror on the screen unless it was a children's movie. And a lot of Italian audiences were obsessed with the movie Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, because it was a Disney cartoon, but it actually had a lot of really scary elements in it.
Hmm.
And people who were fans of scary elements of films, they went to see that, and that really was the best representation of what they could get on the screen in Italy at one point. And then Bava's Black Sunday was one of the movies that really just sort of like, drew on that whole iconography of like the witch in a castle, and it's this ultra gothic setting, and Barbara Steele is like this beautiful, like, not to say she's cartoonish, but she's very she epitomizes a certain kind of gothic aesthetic, and
Right.
that was definitely drawn from the Disney universe. And then, yeah, then later, there was Bava did so many great atmospheric movies, like in the 60s. It really started to develop. And I guess the giallo, a lot of people would argue with you about what the first giallo was, but Blood and Black Lace has got to be one of the first, and that was a Bava film as well.
Right. Right. And yeah, and I don't mean to say that all Italian horror films are giallos, but I mean that they
Oh, I
dominate
know.
the European horror industry for quite some time, and that was one aspect of it. I mean, look at Demons,
Mhm.
which that's Lamberto Bava, right? Not Mario Bava.
Right. Mario Bava's son, Lamberto, who was Mario Bava's AD on a lot of pictures, but
Yeah.
Demons was one of the ones that he directed himself with a little help from Dario Argento.
Yeah. 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 That's right. And that movie, that's one that still scares me to this day. But then I'd like to kind of move things on a little bit here. We've got also there's a lot of Spanish horror films. I think the guy leading the charge was Paul Naschy. I think everybody could agree that he was the guy leading the charge because he just made so many horror films. Some great, some not so great, but
It didn't matter. He was just a great he was an actor who wanted to, obviously get as much work as possible, and this was a lucrative genre. It just happened to be the place where he caught on, and he was good at it. Like he really sort of pioneered that in Spain. He was well known in Spain for more than just horror movies, but in the States, for the export of Paul Naschy was mainly in the horror genre, and he
Yeah,
was just fabulous. He was like the Spanish Lon Chaney.
that's right. And it's funny too because I have a friend, Rod Barnett, who has a show called the Naschy Cast, and they've been talking about Paul Naschy movies for God knows how many years now.
Yeah,
It's unbelievable.
there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We'll do a whole show on him at some point. We'll get Rod on, talk about him. Do you want to talk about a couple of the other Spanish directors?
Uh, Another one that comes to mind is Armando Diasorio, who made the Blind Dead series, and also a lot of other movies that were mostly even kookier than the Blind Dead movies. But Armando Diasorio, he made I think one of the first horror movies he made was Fangs of the Living Dead,
Yeah.
a late 60s vampire movie with Anita Ekberg. And that was one of the, it wasn't a Hammer film, but it kind of looked a little like a Hammer film. And then the Blind Dead, Tombs of the Blind Dead came along, and that was very well received. I mean, there were 3 sequels to it, but he also made some really goofy stuff too, like the Lorelei's Grasp,
Oh yeah.
which was, have you ever seen that
Oh, yeah,
one?
I saw it recently.
Oh my God. I mean, I love it. And it was released in the States. It was X-rated in the United States for the violence.
Oh.
And it was originally released in the States as The Swinging Monster. Think about that one for half a second. But then it came out at the end of the 70s. Someone did a real popular fake out exploitation theatrical release for it and made it look like a slasher film, and they called it When the Screaming Stops.
Oh,
And it's not a slasher movie. It's
right.
about a reptile woman.
That's
They
funny.
they got you in the theater and got your money anyway.
They did that quite often. They even didn't they do that with the first Blind Dead movie? Was they retitled it "Escape from Planet Ape," and they had this whole intro sequence that was only in America that made no sense.
Yes, well, it came along, actually, I think it was 1980 by the time somebody did that. It was just a very limited theatrical releases. Some unscrupulous distributor had a print of Tombs of the Blind Dead, and then they cut off the beginning of the movie and they inserted this voiceover that sort of loosely ties it to the Planet of the Apes
Right.
series, which is amazing because it's about, zombie skeletons that rise from their graves. Somehow you make that a Planet of the Apes film. I don't know how that happens.
That's hilarious. My favorite of the Blind Dead trilogy is the second one. Spence, you've seen that one. It was trying to the people were trapped in this, like, I don't know, Spanish
Like a villa,
villa.
or
Yeah,
an
yeah.
inn.
Oh yes.
I just really enjoyed that one. It was very thrilling, you're with the characters. The first one was more scary
Yeah.
for me than
I
the second
remember
one.
thinking, I remember actually going through that movie and thinking, wow, that like actually was like had enjoyable characters that I actually wanted to see.
Yeah.
I
Which
remember
version
thinking,
did you see?
no idea, couldn't tell you.
I have the set that's like a it's like a coffin shape. The box is shaped like a little coffin. So moving on here, we Jess Franco is also another one. He's a Spanish director, correct?
Yeah, Sam Panico's big on Jess Franco. He just did an entire month of Jess Franco films. He watched every single Jess Franco film, like one after the other, which you really have to have a strong constitution
Right.
to do something like that. But he was one of those European filmmakers that just had a very idiosyncratic way of putting films together. And sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but he never stopped.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah. Go ahead. You were going to say something.
No, I was going to move on to the next thing if you want
Okay. No, that's good.
to. And we could do shows. We're going to do shows on all these. As you know, everybody knows, or at least has heard of some of the Japanese horror films that they've been putting out over the last 30 years. A lot of which have been remade into American for American audiences, like The Grudge and The Ring. Tons of Chinese horror movies that are amazing. The Koreans are putting out a ton of amazing horror films, which Spence, you and I talked about. What was it?
Train to Busan.
Train to Busan. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And they released a sequel to that.
Yes, which we haven't seen yet.
But yeah, I think Parasite was also a Korean film.
The one with the 3D movie with Demi Moore.
The one from recently, I don't know. My girlfriend talks about Parasite all the time. She's like, "Oh, you have to see it," and then she doesn't show me it. So I'm not sure. I think that one's Korean as well. But yeah, no, the Korean market for horror movies has been really good. They've got a lot of great creativity coming out of there, and a lot of it isn't like particularly culturally different from anything else that we've seen. I mean, Train to Busan, as good as it is for a movie, nothing about it could not work in other countries. You know what I mean?
Right.
It works in every country. It just so happens to be made by Korean filmmakers and stuff like that. So I don't know. I liked it. I thought that was pretty good. It's like a zombie film where you're stuck on a train and all this stuff, and it just gets worse and worse. It falls into a category of zombie films that I like, where I like the horde type stuff. I like when there's waves and waves of them, because especially growing up on like Resident Evil, intimate zombie encounters are like the thing. And
Yeah.
you know, it works, right? Obviously, when it comes to just pure budgeting, it makes perfect sense. You put up one guy in makeup, you can have a whole chase sequence, right? It works. But when you have the budget for it and the options for it, like there's a whole game about World War Z, and it's all this horde mode stuff where like there's just whole waves of zombies coming at you, and they like start climbing all over each other and stuff like that, and it's scary as hell. But you know, I like that stuff. I think that's really cool. That also, World War Z is also, I think, a good one where it ties into the disaster film section,
Yes.
where I think disaster films are a very nice niche when you have different subject material. You can have a monster, you can have a zombie apocalypse and stuff like that, and I think that works. It doesn't always work, but it can work.
Yeah.
I don't know. I like sci-fi horror films too, but like the Sci-Fi Channel. I like those ones where they just get wacky. I remember one, it was a disaster film, but it was like a Christmas one. So it turns out that the 12 Days of Christmas was actually like a prophecy, and like there was these disasters going on, and like the only thing I remember is 12 drummers drumming was actually 12 volcanoes that suddenly popped out of nowhere. I thought that was pretty funny. I thought that worked pretty good for what they're trying to do. You talk about exploitation films, the Sci-Fi Channel is become the current king of those.
Well, that is true. I mean, that you don't see films like that theatrically anymore. Now you see them on TV.
Right.
And you know, the really gruesome stuff that used to show up in R-rated horror movies, and you went to see them because they were so gruesome. Now you see that kind of thing on television.
Oh yeah.
On Law and Order SVU.
Yep.
Or Law and Order. I've seen some really gruesome things on those programs, and the ID Network, which delves deeply into the pain of real life tragedies and then brings it right out there on screen. These are the exploitation films of our day.
Yeah, especially for when I'm get back to my topic on what horror movies are about. I don't know if anybody's realized this, but in the past, at least the mid 2000s, there was a lot of hold on, correct me if I'm wrong. Scream came out in 1997?
96.
Yeah.
96. Okay, so that was kind of the start where there was a lot of like close to home type horror. You had The Purge, you had Paranormal Activity, and these became whole franchises. You had even the couple Ouija ones, they were like, you know, things that could happen to your family. You know, Paranormal Activity had this whole like you were like a new it was like a new couple, right? Or something like that. They had like just moved into this new house and that whole ordeal. So you had a whole subsection of movies that were about these like almost home invasion situations. Scream, I count that in that category because it's a lot of the scary scenes are the fact that this person who this serial killer is now coming after you in your house. You don't go to Camp Crystal Lake and get killed. You don't fall asleep with Freddy, who's got this supernatural aspect. You don't have to deal with like, okay, on Halloween night, we get guns. Other than that, we're good to go. Like, we're not dealing with that. We have things that can happen at any given point, which is scary, and that's what scares people, right? When you get inside their own home, there's a whole ton of them. Insidious, even what was that one, Brightburn, where it was like Superman, but it turns out the kid was actually just like killing people and just like
Yeah,
psychotic
he's a
and all that
monster.
stuff. Yeah, it's rough, and that whole subsection of films has absolutely been dominating the market for the most part when it comes to getting people my age interested in horror films, because that's what scares millennials. Is they're the ones who now have to deal with, like the 2008 crisis, the financial crisis, right? Like getting a house now seems horribly daunting because every house is probably haunted.
No kidding.
It's so much worse now for at least those people who were coming of age when that kind of like downgrade for the economy was happening.
Well, and the horror movies have ruined everything for us. We can't go camping because of Jason. We can't go swimming because of Jaws. We can't go trick or treating because of Michael Myers. I mean, come on.
Yeah, and I mean, me personally, my brand of horror, the horror I like is the most fantastic. I like the kaiju. I like the fly. I like the thing. I like slasher films. I don't like horror that hits close to home, like, oh, this is it's like a situation where your friend gets kidnapped and you have to go find them. Like, that to me feels awful. Awful.
Yeah.
I don't like that. I like my monsters. Give me my creature from the Black Lagoon. Give me my Godzilla. Do not give me these horrible traumatic experiences that actually happen to people. I
Yeah,
don't want
that's
that.
how I feel about Last House on the Left, which was 1972 is when that movie came out, but it was one of the first of that sort of like magic thing that happens where like all of a sudden there's a new kind of horror movie. Now this is all about, there had been movies that came before, but none of them were as graphic as Last House on the Left about kidnapping and torture. And I don't know, like I really didn't want to watch stuff like that. It's a good movie and it's scary, but it's not the kind of thing I'd want to see more than once.
Right.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I mean, even when it comes to a media of horror that we're yet to talk about is like analog games, like tabletop games. There are tabletop horror games. One of the most famous ones that I can attest to is Vampire the Masquerade. And it's a tabletop role-playing game. You play as a vampire, and it's basically they describe it as it's about personal and political horror of the fact that you have to survive by killing people, which is rough, and it's meant to be this intimate experience. But looking through it, I like the fantastic elements. I don't like the idea of like describing draining someone of blood who didn't deserve it. Like that doesn't sit right with me. So I love what they had intended for, but it just makes me uncomfortable. And I think that's good, but it's not what I want to be doing, at least in that setting. It's
And
a
I think
weird
I think
situation.
that can turn a lot of people off from watching horror movies because they're afraid they're all like that. But then let's continue down the list here. We've got Mexican horror movies, and they started with they had quite a few in the past. Like the Brainiac was one of the first ones I ever saw that was a Mexican horror movie, and I have to tell you, I am so happy that I just discovered that Tubi has Mexican wrestling movies. I just watched a Blue Demon film the other night, and I'm in the middle of watching a Santo film now. Well, not now, but obviously I had to pause it. Are you into that, Bill, at all?
Oh yeah, I'm not as into it as Sam is. I mean, Sam knows everything about these movies, but I'm really interested in like you mentioned the Brainiac. That was a really exciting thing for me to finally find after reading about it for so many years as one of the worst films ever made. Because of course, if you call something that, I'm going to seek it out and watch it. And it's nowhere near the worst film ever made, but it is really bizarre. So I don't know if there's a cultural equivalent of that. There was another movie about La Lorna, um, The Curse of the Crying Woman.
Yeah.
They remade it recently, like in
Yeah, I
it came
remember
out
The Curse of
sometime.
La Llorona. I
Yeah.
remember
Yeah,
when that came
I saw
out.
that. It was part of the
Lorna,
Ed and
not
Lorraine
Lorna.
series that they're doing. What'd you say?
I called her Lorna instead
Oh,
of Lorna. But yeah, those things really interested me. And the wrestling vampire movies did too. Or the wrestling monster movies.
yeah.
There was a wrestling vampire movie, Santo versus the Vampire Women.
Right.
And then also there was a whole vampire series. It started with The Bloody Vampire, I think was the first one. And there were numerous sequels, and there was even one called The World of Vampires about an organ. It was this creepy looking organ that whenever you played it, it summoned vampires. It's just it's really strange, the ideas that would never you would probably never see anything like that in an American film. So it
Right.
makes it very unique.
And is Ray Cardona, the name comes up, is he who's he a director?
Rene Cardona, yeah, he was a director. He made a couple of really memorable things. Like if you're talking about the horror genre, he didn't only work in the horror genre or fantastic films. He made that version of that movie called Santa Claus from 1959, I think, is when
With
he made
with the
that.
devil in it?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's Rene Cardona. And he also did a movie called Night of the Bloody Apes.
Oh yeah. I've seen that.
Have you seen that one? Speaking of movies that have wrestling in it, Night of the Bloody Apes has wrestling in it too. It also has actual open heart surgery footage
That's right.
inserted into it for really no reason other than to show some true life gore.
They couldn't afford the effect, so
Gore, yeah. Why pay for it when you can do something like that?
that's
Another great thing, we were talking earlier about exploitation films, and Rene Cardona made a movie um, about the Chilean air crash where the survivors had to resort to cannibalism.
oh yeah.
And it actually was I'm never going to be able to pronounce the original Supervivientes de los Andes, and
Hmm.
I'm sure I pronounced that completely incorrectly. In America, it was known as Survive.
Okay, yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
and this was sort of like a fluke that happened. One of the producers of Grease, I think it was Alan Carr, was on vacation in uh, Mexico, and he saw lines down the street for this movie, and people were waiting like a long time to get in to see this movie, and he went to see it, and he suggested that Paramount purchase it and for American distribution, and they polished it and they like changed the soundtrack and made it look a little bit more professional and released it, and it became a really big box office hit as Survive in 1976.
Yeah.
And so that was an exploitation turn for the Cardonas. And then Rene Cardona's son, Rene Cardona Jr., he's also well known for making a lot of exploitation films and disaster movies. He made one called Cyclone about a natural disaster that strands several different groups of characters. He made that in 78. He made a Jaws ripoff called Tintorera. That's really good. It's like basically a softcore porn film with with a shark subplot in it. Um, a lot of great stuff from those guys.
That's awesome. I think that just recently came out on Blu-ray. Tintorera.
Tintorera,
In the last
it did.
decade.
No, just like last year,
Was it
somebody
last
put
year?
it out. Yeah, I mean it's been out before. It wasn't the first time it came out, but somebody did a Blu-ray last year. I'm
I
Yeah.
pretty sure.
I hate like sexuality in my films. I don't like it. It doesn't make the movie better. Like I can understand it maybe for a subplot and maybe romance, but it doesn't make the movie better in my opinion. Of course, my father here will disagree with you. He'll say it's required for a movie from the 70s, but I don't think so. I really don't. I don't watch a horror movie to watch a sex scene. I watch a horror movie to watch some poor girl get chased around by Jason and then find a way to cut his head off. That's what I'm looking for. I'm not interested in I'm not interested in even with the slasher genre, as much as I love it and I understand what they were shooting for, I still find a lot of the sex scenes stupid and unnecessary. Even in the latest one, the latest Friday the 13th film, the sex scene's very graphic. It's got like porn level dialogue, and,
Sure.
and it's I don't see the value artistically. It doesn't do it for me.
No horror movie is an artistic statement, no matter what the director tells you.
Right.
You just had to be there to understand the whole sex thing. Like it's everywhere now. Like again, you can see really graphic sexually oriented stuff on television. And even if it's not sex, it's like, people in revealing costumes, and you see a lot more of the body nowadays than you did back even in the 60s, the 70s. Movies that showed skin were scandalous, but people went to them for that reason too. So some directors were giving you, like, they give you some skin and they also give you some blood and something to scream at. There's your movie. It makes thousands of dollars on the drive-in circuit.
It's so funny. The most recent Santo film that I've been watching. These two ladies. Actually, I think it's one lady playing twins, and she's got huge tracts of land in this skimpy little outfit. Excuse me. And
Tracts of
it's like
land.
there's really no reason for it except it keeps my attention. So
Yeah,
Sure.
exactly right. I mean, me personally, I like explanations in my media, and I like consistency, and I do like any level of intellectual value and stuff like that, or like, in whatever way it is. Some movies aren't very creative, but they pay homage to creative things, so I'm okay with it. I hear this a lot. The movie Van Helsing with Hugh Jackman from 2004, in my opinion, is an excellent movie, but not because it broke the mold, because it reinvented an old one that I liked and stuff like that. And you didn't, and you, I don't care for stupid shit like that. I hate it. It ruins it for me
that's
because
funny.
then I'm going through and I'm like, well, what's the point of watching this if the filmmakers aren't even going to put intellectual effort into it?
It always made me uncomfortable as a kid because my mother would have to cover my eyes if there was naked people.
Yeah, it's ruined many a movie for me as a kid. It doesn't benefit, like, you can let a little kid watch a scary movie and they can know when something's scary and look away, but they have no concept of when you see naked people what to do and how to react, because then they have to perceive themselves, right? If it's a fantastic situation, kids do their thing, but if it's some girl in a skimpy outfit, well, now some small kid is gonna perceive that and see that again somewhere and then put two and two together, and it's only going to get worse. Doesn't
Oh,
work.
what could happen?
Excuse me. That's a topic for another day. So we're like over an hour and a half here. So I'm going to quickly go through the rest of the topics that we'll be talking about on this show. In terms of movies, you've also got horror comedies, as Spence mentioned, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, all the way down to Ghostbusters and more in recent days. There's just tons of those. That's going to be a whole topic for us to go over. Of course, cannibal films is a good topic because those are hard to watch. If you want to get into horror movies, don't watch any of the cannibal horror films.
What do you mean, of course, cannibal films? Like it's a given.
Well, it's a category that needs to be discussed. You've what I termed are adjacent genres. We kind of talk about some of these on the East Meets the West is, sci-fi, Euro spy, luchador films, Italian sci-fi, spaghetti westerns, kung fu films. There's all kinds of other adjacent genres that we could touch upon. And then, like Spence said at the beginning, horror isn't just limited to movies. There's all kinds of media. As we talked about, there are TV shows and horror hosts. Was already mentioned, like people like Edgar Allan Poe, Lovecraft, Stephen King, which, like you Spence, interesting. They're all from New England.
Yeah, some of the three greatest horror authors that we have in America, at least, We have Edgar Allan Poe, who is like from Boston. We have H.P. Lovecraft, who is from Rhode Island, and then we have Stephen King, who is from like Maine.
Yeah.
So
Must
I
be
don't know
something
what
in the
New England
water.
has. Yeah, I don't know what it is, but for some reason, the greatest horror literature tends to come from New England. Not
Yeah.
all of it, but some of the better ones.
A lot of it does. But like we mentioned earlier, I grew up and Bill grew up going to the library getting books. I have a couple of props here. This is a book called Space Monsters from Movies, TV, and Books by Seymour Simon. And it's got the Metalunian mutant there on the cover.
Oh,
And these are the types of books that, as a kid, they all I'm not even doing it any justice here, but they all had well, they're chock full of pictures here.
And
You get the
words, how
idea.
dare they?
That's Escape, what do you call it? Not Mars Attacks, Invaders from Mars.
oh yeah, right.
These books are awesome. I have a whole bunch of them. I couldn't really dig them out. There was a couple of series of books. If you can still find them, they're getting up in price. This one is by Green and Sanford, and there's a whole bunch of them. This particular one is about the movie The Black Cat, which I don't know if it's the Karloff Black Cat. I don't think it is. But I don't know if I actually showed you the cover properly. And they're like a square bound, nice quality. They're awesome. You can find them online, but like I said, they go up in price. And this one, Crestwood House put out a series of books about monster movies. This one's about the Blob, which is my grandson's favorite horror movie. He's 5 and he loves. Well, actually, I think he's replaced that with Predator now.
But that's still on the cover is from the sequel, Beware the Blob.
That's right. I was going to see if you noticed that.
Beware the Blob is one of my favorite weed movies. I mean, horror movies.
Oh man, and these covered all the books. Say The Invisible Man, The Deadly Mantis, It Came from Outer Space, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Wolf Man, The Mummy, Frankenstein, King Kong, Dracula. The Godzilla one is ridiculously expensive. I forget, it's like $300 or something if you want the Godzilla one. But I saved a bunch of those, and I just wanted to show people real quick too. We also grew up. Well, Bill and I grew up reading monster magazines. And if I can share the pictures here, let's see. We can see if I can get to the next page. Oh yeah, I'll go back and I'll go full screen. Famous Monsters of Filmland is undoubtedly the most popular of the monster magazines. It's still in production today. I think there was a big kerfluffle about who owned the rights to it, and so I'm not going to go into that because that's a show in and of itself. But this was the one. Do you want to speak to it a little bit, Bill?
It's certainly one of my big gateway. This was a gateway drug for me. Famous Monsters.
Yeah.
And Fangoria actually was the first monster magazine that I ever noticed. It was like around 79. I guess I started getting into Fangoria, but then somehow there was Famous Monsters right in front of my face too. I think it was when we got it. There was a newsstand that opened up in my hometown, and they carried both of those. So I would just go in there and I would hang around and read it there without buying it, and the guy would yell at me. So eventually started paying for it and bringing it home. The Famous Monsters just really changed my life because of, even more so than Fangoria, because Famous Monsters, both movies are about monster or horror fandom, but Famous Monsters really spoke to, I was only like 9 years old. There's something very wonderfully childlike about Famous Monsters and the writing in it, especially. And not to say that it was juvenile, but that sense of wonder that you have as a child for films. Forey Ackerman never lost that. And it's something that I really aspire to personally, because it makes life worth living.
Oh yeah.
So, and this was one outlet for it, Famous Monsters. As Fangoria also changed my life because it was just, the first time I'd ever seen explicit gore in pictures in a magazine. And again, it shocked everyone, all the adults around me who saw it.
And do you remember Gore Zone magazine too?
I do. Yeah. I don't know. I never bought Gore Zone for some reason. I wasn't a Gore Zone reader.
I have a whole bunch in my collection, but my new favorite magazine is called Driving Asylum.
Tell
Mr. Bill Van Ryn himself.
us more about Driving Asylum, Roger.
Well,
Re-Gor.
it is this
Sorry.
amazing fanzine where throughout the whole thing, from cover to cover, he has not only articles, awesome articles by some awesome people, um, but he also has newspaper movie ads, which we've talked about in other realms. I'm trying to get this in the camera here. It's a lost art, movie advertisements in newspapers, and Bill does a
Yeah.
job researching them and finding awesome ones. Um, I do the same thing on my retro TV guide page, but Bill takes it to a whole nother level by making a magazine out of these films. That it's like movie posters. We had a conversation on the show recently about how movie posters, there used to be an art to it. And now when you're on streaming services, there's no posters depicting maybe a scene from the film. It's just the actors' faces.
Yeah, it's the way that we sell movies and market movies has completely changed to where that's sort of become, if not obsolete, just a very small footnote in a film's life. Whereas, when I was younger, I can remember that being a large part of the film's life, because sometimes you didn't even get to go see those movies. It was exciting. You would look in the newspaper and there'd be these ads for something shocking or sensational. And it made me very excited to find things like that in the newspaper, even if I ended up not seeing the film. So that's something that is lost now, or it has changed so much that I can't recognize it anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
for me, even with like how we market games now, it's tabletop games. I still don't get how tabletop games ever come to life because I don't see any kind of advertisement for them outside of game stores and on specific websites that have this stuff. So I don't understand how they market their stuff whatsoever because they must be doing it to severely niche groups. Vampire the Masquerade was one of my favorites, and it has the fifth edition just came out, and I have that. One of its sequels is coming out soon, and I don't understand how they market that at all. And I love the art and stuff, but I don't understand how you're supposed to market that. Games have this like lifespan of marketing. Resident Evil 8 was like announced multiple months before, and they were slowly releasing images and teasers and stuff and letting the hype grow before they released the game and all
Yeah.
this stuff. So they had to do this whole ordeal. And the art for games specifically, because the way game shopping works online is like, you see this poster for the game, so the art for it actually is super important, which I really enjoy that actually, because yes, you do get a lot of like people's faces, but you also get a lot of like it actually hints at something more and you can kind of like glean something from the art when it comes to games, so I always really enjoyed that. But movie posters are a different breed. They're definitely not nearly as well loved and well cared for, I think, as they should be.
Well, this isn't even movie posters exactly. It's actually newsprint ads. It often was the theatrical one sheet, but sometimes it wasn't. I mean, there was a different way of even just putting the little ads together to lure you into the theater, to somehow sell you this property just from one single image, a tiny little square on a page in your newspaper. So that's what I'm obsessed with. One of the things I'm obsessed with, and that's what made me want to start putting the zine together.
Yeah, you've definitely fueled my already existing obsession with them because I'll often
Oh,
find a page
good.
of yeah, I'll often find a page of movies. I'm like, wait a minute, I saw that, I saw that, I saw that. Why did my parents take me in to see that? Why didn't I see that one? What's going on here? There's like three or four we should have seen that we didn't because we used to go like every week. So I discover new movies all the time. You think you've heard of every movie in existence. There's way more than you'll ever know. But moving on a
Mhm.
little bit. So Spence, why don't you get into a little bit of the tabletop role playing games or RPGs as they're known, and talk a little bit about that so we can know that when we have you back, we'll have you back on a specific show to talk about that and maybe video games as a separate topic.
I mentioned the World of Darkness. That's kind of probably the biggest one because their focus is horror and like interpersonal horror is a lot of what they do. The one of their other famous IPs is Werewolf the Apocalypse, and
Yes.
that's kind of this environmental activism kind of deal, and they're releasing a 5th edition for it later, and they're marketing it as, you know, reacting to actually like climate change issues today. And it's pretty cool because it's basically their whole like extremism is kind of the big deal, and so that's also a big deal in Vampire the Masquerade as well. But there's more than just that when it comes to the horror aspect of role-playing games. Call of Cthulhu is on its 7th edition, and that to me is bonkers. That's like the farthest edition I've ever seen. And Call of Cthulhu is a lot more on the cosmic horror scale, because it takes H.P. Lovecraft and all of his work and turns it into a tabletop role-playing game where you are yeah, here we go. Here's the graphic for it now. This is the cover for the Keeper's Rulebook, which is, you know, the Bible when it comes to playing this game. And you play as an investigator, and you have to investigate all these supernatural phenomenon that your game master puts forward, and it kind of always ends up leading to getting worse and worse. And you know, these greater than comprehension beings, and that's kind of the whole thing. And it's about managing your sanity and managing your, you know, your mental health and all this stuff, and you have to like take time to do that in the game world. So it's kind of interesting because one of the ways you can lose your characters isn't just like death, it's actually a loss of sanity. So I always thought that was really, really cool. There are some other horror things in more mainstream stuff. So Dungeons and Dragons is obviously fantasy, but one of their most famous adventures is Curse of Strahd, and this has been around since I think 1st edition, might be 2nd edition. This is one of the most famous adventure modules. It's the only one that I know of that has actually lasted from like level 1 to maximum level. So for 5th edition, they remade it, and they did it a lot more with a lot more cultural, being a lot more culturally conscious of like, you know, how they characterized what was predominantly, you know, Romanian culture. And so it's a lot more, it's meant to be a lot more accurate while still keeping the enjoyment of it being kind of this scary domain of dread type deal. They released a whole setting book for the place is called Ravenloft. So, you know, Strahd von Barovich or something like that. He's, you know, the equivalent of Dracula, and that's the whole deal. And the Ravenloft setting book is all about different kinds of horror that you can input in your game. You know, there's body horror, there's cosmic horror, and all that stuff. So those are probably the big 3 that I can think of when it comes to tabletop horror. I mean, we all love a good scary game, and I love doing that to the people I play with. So I'm having a lot of fun with that.
I've scared the crap out of you quite a bit in Call of Cthulhu.
You've no idea, especially because I care about my characters, right? I mean, I build people. It's not just like a video game where I'm doing a run of the same story. Like I'm building a person who I characterize. I care. So I think it's pretty cool. And thankfully nowadays tabletop role-playing games are making a massive resurgence thanks to, I'm not quite sure what it is. I think it's Dungeons and Dragons, but there's a lot of other options out there. So when it comes to the horror aspect, the World of Darkness, intellectual property, Call of Cthulhu, and the Curse of Strahd adventure and D&D are like the big ones that come to mind. There's other stuff out there. Like Cyberpunk is a pretty fun one that has to do with a lot more like are you really a person if you're, you know, synthetic and you don't have your own body anymore, all that stuff. So they do have those philosophic questions, but it's not nearly as scary as the genuine like threat of losing your character to becoming insane.
Right. Bill, have you ever played a role-playing game?
No, I know nothing about them. I'm not kidding either. Yeah, I never got into it, so I really can't talk about that.
Yeah. Well, that's too bad. They're really fun. It's basically in essence you're a character, and all your decisions of actions are based on the roll of dice. So you could be any kind of character in any kind of setting, but it's just a matter like you have statistics like strength and dexterity and constitution, and you know you have skills like whether it's using a weapon or providing first aid to someone or finding things, you know, and those skills are all assigned a numerical value, and then that's how you make the dice rolls to determine whether you succeed or not. So it's pretty fun if you ever
one of
find
the
a group.
one of the people at the table is the game master, for lack of a
Right.
better term. In D&D, they're the dungeon master or the keeper in Call of Cthulhu, and they are the ones putting the story forward. They're the ones playing the monsters and the outside world, and then everyone else is a player, and their characters are the ones who they dictate what they're doing. They say, oh, I want to walk up to that person and talk to him, and then you kind of role play out how that would work. So being a DM is hard work. I think it's really fun. I'm getting Re-Gor here into fifth edition as much as I possibly can.
Of D&D.
I like fifth edition of D&D. It's a lot of fun. I think it's definitely added to the resurgence of them, because they were the nerd stuff back in 30 years, all the way from the 80s, 90s, even into the 2000s. Only recently has it been like a socially acceptable hobby now. Like now, even like, with the stereotypes, every single tabletop game I've ever played, with the exception of solo one-on-ones that I've had with you, Re-Gor, has been I've had at least one girl at the table.
Right.
So it's not this, like, it's not a male dominated genre anymore. It's now that it's definitely now being shared by just about everybody, and I really enjoy that.
Right, right. So we're coming up on 2 hours here, so we're going to start to wrap things up. Spencer had mentioned video games earlier in the show, and we're definitely going to do a whole one on that. Bill and I know next to nothing about video games except our old Ataris, so we'll have Spencer back to talk about that. I wanted to sort of wrap things up with, I'm going to skip a couple of the questions here and jump right to, why do we love horror so much? And then why do we love it so much that we're putting this show together for you, the listener, you, the viewer, to hear what we have to pontificate about and what our guests will talk about? Well, for me, I find horror movies to be like a roller coaster ride, only safer. I love to be scared. I don't like I won't watch CSI. I think you mentioned that, Bill. I won't watch those shows. Those are too depressing to me. They're too gruesome. I can't even watch those commercials with the starving kids in them. But if it's fake horror, I love it, and I can still get scared. I get scared to this day. One of the recent shows I've been obsessed with, and that's a whole topic for another day, is a documentary series on the History Channel called The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, where they've got like this astrophysicist and all these scientists investigating Skinwalker Ranch, which is in Utah, and it's been a hotbed of paranormal activity for like hundreds of years. And things are happening to these guys in real life. One guy gets blasted with gamma radiation. They don't know where it came from, to the point where he had like a growth on his finger because of it. They had to cut the growth off, and just all kinds of crazy things happening. So things can still scare me, but I enjoy it. I've often had people over the years say, well, why do you like that? It's so scary. I'm like, well, that's the whole point. Because it's a thrill without the danger, say, of a roller coaster, Bill?
It's just sort of I've always been fascinated by it, and I can't really even explain why. But probably a lot of it has to do with the same reason, like you mentioned, the roller coaster. The reason you go on it is because it gives you a thrill, but you really don't think you're going to die. It's a way of confronting death, really, and that's what horror films do for us. They show us something where we simulate looking at somebody's death, or something similarly terrifying, where death is the threat that hangs over it, and maybe even something worse than death if you're talking about supernatural films. But that's probably the reason why. There's just like a morbid thrill to look at that kind of stuff. And also, there's a lot of imaginative things that are in horror, fantasy, science fiction, any kind of movie like that, because we don't have actual data that show us the supernatural. Like, the supernatural is I don't know what anyone believes personally, but I won't believe anything supernatural until someone can show it to me, until we can all see it and we can test it and we can know that it's there. Until then, we have the movies and media, stories, books. We have these role-playing games. We have these things to show us things that are fantastic, and to create these mythologies. That's the appeal of it for me, I think.
Awesome. Spence?
Yeah, I think you guys covered all the major stuff. It can be narrowed down to something you've told me since I was very little. It's fun to be scared. I think that's absolutely valid, and I think getting a start out of things, and being in a situation where you're watching something, or doing something that is, essentially a horrific experience, a truly traumatic experience, but it's not real. That's the fun of it, is that
Yeah.
we get to enjoy it, but it's not real. I'm a lot more numb to horror movies than Re-Gor is because he grew up on them. He jumps at movies he's seen. I I have been playing Resident Evil, so I'm a lot less afraid of most movies because more comfortable with okay, I have to be the one to walk by this guy. I have to be the one to get chased by him, because it really does feel like you're there in a lot of the games, and I think that kind of works for me. Is I like playing. I mean, they're still making Resident Evil games, and the first one came out in 1997. So
Right.
clearly they're doing something right. Scaring their viewers is what they do. So I'm definitely into the it's fun to be scared mentality. But also, the other half of that for me is the fact that I just love scary, interesting giant monsters. I love me a good werewolf. I love me a good vampire. I love me a good kaiju movie. So if I can have that, that just makes me happy. Even like Alien. I love Alien and all that stuff. So monsters are a big one for me, and just it can be fun to be scared is really what draws me to this whole genre. Plus, there's a lot of options when it comes to exploring concepts. Like you said, it's hard to watch NCIS when it's an actually traumatic experience that you may know something about, versus the monster that came from the meteor, right? It's a lot
Right.
easier to deal with that. So I think there's a lot of options there, and there's a lot of philosophic implications that you can have as well, and just dissecting characters. And I think it's kind of the best catch-all genre to look at other things through.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I just wanted to mention real quickly, the wife and I went and saw that movie Uncharted recently, the one with Tom Holland and Mark Wahlberg. And far from a horror movie, it's like an Indiana Jones type action movie. But there was a scene where I did not expect it, where someone jumped out, and I think they might have like smacked somebody in the face with a stick or a pipe or something. And I audibly screamed in the theater, and I was like, oh. Right after the scream came out of my mouth, it was so involuntary. But that just goes to show you how just even a scare in a non-horror movie can be scary.
No,
You're,
exactly.
you're easy. You're easy.
Yeah, I guess so.
It's so bad. Uncharted is a video game movie.
Yes, I know.
Uncharted
I
is
didn't find that out till just before the film, when
yeah,
the
it's a
actors were on the
famous
stupid commercials they play now talking about the game.
yeah, it's a famous PlayStation Sony title. They've
It was a
always
good
had
movie.
rights to it.
I wouldn't, if it wasn't for my stepson, I wouldn't have actually wanted to go see it. I probably would never have seen it. And then he said he wanted to go see it, so we took him, and it was really enjoyable. So,
Yeah.
well, first of all, Bill and Spence, thank you for joining me on this inaugural episode. I know, Spence, you're not going to be on every single one, but we'll continue to invite you back and for talk about topics that you're really knowledgeable in.
I will do my best. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. So, folks, thanks for stopping by the Fright Lounge. Starting with episode 2, we're going to attempt to be live on the first Sunday of every month. So please join our Facebook group to join in the conversation, as well as find out what the topics and special guests will be as new episodes come up. I'm Re-Gor, and you can find my shows at havenpodcasts.com.
I'm Bill Van Ryn, and you can pick up my fanzine Drive-In Asylum at our Etsy shop. It's called Groovy Doom. You also find a Facebook page with that name, where I share newsprint images every day of vintage horror exploitation genre films. And every Saturday night at 8 p.m., my creative partner Sam Panico and I do a weekly webcast called the Drive-In Asylum Double Feature. And it's on the Groovy Doom YouTube page and Facebook page. You can pick it up there.
Awesome. Awesome. And I promise, Bill, next time I come on your show, I'm not going to fall asleep. I told my wife I wanted to come back sometime. She's like, you'll never make it through. You always try to watch it when you're not even on there and you fall asleep.
That's all right. We had a graphic image we put up in your place.
Oh, good. I'll send
Did you go back and watch it?
Huh?
Did you go back and watch that
Yes.
episode?
Yes.
Okay, so I had an image of that actress that we were talking about in from Werewolf versus Vampire Woman, except she wasn't really in it. So she took your place.
Aye, aye, aye. All right, folks. Well, thanks a lot, and join us again on episode 2.
Bye-bye.
Ooh.